Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we call the presidential horse race and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Today, two scholars teach us about globalization. One says we voters seldom look at the data, so we have our trade and manufacturing facts wrong. The other says the solutions to jobs, immigration, and other international challenges should come from leaders closer to the people, city mayors. We begin, though, with the big campaign news of the week, the FBI removing a high hurdle from the track. Yes, time for the horse race. And the hurdle, of course, was the specter of Hillary Clinton getting indicted for Emailgate. On Tuesday, FBI Director James Comey approached the podium, detailed at length his thorough investigation, and concluded, as millions held their breath, that although there was evidence of potential violations of laws in Clinton's handling of classified information, in the FBI's judgment, no reasonable prosecutor would bring such a case. And why not? Well, many reasons, according to Comey, including how similar situations were handled in the past.
All the cases prosecuted involved some combination of clearly intentional and willful mishandling of classified information, or vast quantities of information exposed in such a way as to support an inference of intentional misconduct, or indications of disloyalty to the United States, or efforts to obstruct justice. We do not see those things here.
Attorney General Loretta Lynch will surely follow the FBI's advice not to indict. The AG pledged to follow Comey's lead after that unfortunate encounter with Bill Clinton on the tarmac. But the FBI's investigation does contain bad news for Hillary Clinton. The former Secretary of State has claimed she never sent material marked classified via her unsecured email, but the report says she did. Donald Trump's response? He suggested Lynch was bribed with a promise of staying on as AG, something that has been reported, but Hillary has never said publicly. Trump also reiterated his message on Twitter that the system was rigged, a message which he hopes will win over Bernie Sanders supporters, who next to Trump himself were the biggest losers when the FBI left Hillary still standing. Across election betting markets, those wagering on Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden lost big as their hopes of a catastrophe striking the Clinton campaign were further reduced. And while Clinton may still lead in state and national head-to-head polls against Trump, she has been running neck and neck with the Republican candidate on trustworthiness. The FBI report may hurt her further on this. In a June CBS News poll, 2/3 of respondents judged neither Clinton nor Trump to be honest or trustworthy, but for Clinton, the distrust ran deeper. When registered voters were asked whether they think Clinton says what she believes, just 1/3 agreed, while over half said Trump does. And among the independents, shown here in the lower right box, crucial to this November's election, 42% thought that what Clinton did with her email was illegal. Will the FBI judgment lower that number? Unknown. On to the money. How much did Donald Trump spend on political ads last month? $0, while his Democratic opponent spent about $500,000 a day, according to data released by Kantar Media. But as predicted, ever since the beginning of his campaign, Donald Trump still gets plenty of free media coverage every time he opens his mouth or sends out a Twitter message. The most recent case, of course, being when Trump retweeted this image of Hillary Clinton next to a Star of David and a pile of cash last week. The words say most corrupt candidate ever. The image had originally appeared on a neo-Nazi message board. While Trump continues to blame the press for drumming up the controversy, many consider it to be part of a coordinated campaign effort. Social media company Little Bird analyzed Trump's Twitter account and found that during 1 week in January, almost 2/3 of the candidate's retweets were from followers of white supremacists' accounts. Fortune magazine goes on to report this week that since the beginning of his campaign for President of the United States, Donald Trump has retweeted at least 75 followers of 3 of the Internet's top 50 white supremacist influencers. While most of those retweets were merely praising the candidate, and all messages from those Twitter users may not be racist or bigoted, it does show who Trump's campaign is listening to. The magazine also reported that several Trump campaign staffers are following one or more white supremacist accounts. Such alternative right groups often subscribe to and promote various anti-government conspiracy theories, and while Donald Trump has no control over who follows and praises him on Twitter, he and his campaign do control who and what messages get amplified to his 10 million followers. All right, let's drill down on one issue that's seen as central to Trump's campaign: globalization.
We got here because we switched from a policy of Americanism, focusing on what's good for America's middle class, to a policy of globalism, focusing on how to make money for large corporations who can move their wealth and workers to foreign countries, all to the detriment of the American worker and the American economy itself.
Oversimplified, yes, but essentially right or way wrong. Joining us, 2 guests. Dr. Benjamin Barber believes the mayors of cities around the world know better than national leaders how to reshape trade and immigration to benefit more people, and he is working to give mayors more of a voice. Dr. Barber is Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Fordham University Urban Consortium. And with us as well, via Skype, a man who knows how to translate economics into English, the host of the podcast Econ Talk, Russ Roberts. Roberts is a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and author of many books, including The Choice, A Fable of Free Trade and Protection. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Brian.
Good to be with you, Brian.
So let me start with you in Stanford. Since you translate economics into English, how about the word globalism? Trump said Americanism versus globalism, or people say globalization. And we often don't know what we mean by that. Can you translate that into English?
I'll do my best. Globalization usually means something about open borders to products and open borders to people. It's the fact that we're more interconnected. And I think at the root of Trump's critique of the concept is an idea that somehow trade with foreign nations or immigration is a zero-sum game, that somehow if I win, you have to lose. If America wins, someone has to lose. If China's getting ahead, we must be falling behind. And that simply is not the case. It's not the case at all. Historically, it's not the case now. Trade tends to benefit both partners, certainly both people who directly trade with each other. But even at the national level, trade tends to benefit both countries that trade with each other. Certainly individuals within a country may struggle in the face of foreign competition, but for the economy as a whole, it tends to be beneficial in the form of lower prices, innovation, more competition, and new opportunities for workers who want to do something different than what their parents did.
Do you have a take on this, pro-globalization or anti-globalization? Because he makes it sound like, except for a few losers along the way, this is really good for everybody, and fewer people seem to believe that.
Well, Brian, here's the distinction we have to make. Globalization suggests a set of policies and actions to open borders, to allow immigration, to support free trade. My term is interdependence, and it's not a prescription, it's a description of reality. We live in a world of interdependence, regardless of whether we like it or not. Criminals, drugs, climate change, technology, markets, jobs, they all cross borders without passports. It's a global world. That interconnectivity our friend talked about is absolutely crucial. The world is interdependent. The question is, what do we do with it? My view is that when sovereign nations try to put up walls and block it, they go backwards in time and refuse to recognize the reality. The question is, will we have constructive democratic interdependence or destructive privileged monopolistic interdependence? That's the only choice we have.
And we'll get to the mayor's role in that as we go. But do you understand Bernie Sanders' position? Compared to Donald Trump, he also opposes strenuously the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that 12-nation Pacific trade deal that President Obama negotiated. So he's kind of anti-free trade in a similar way to Trump. But he speaks like you speak and says we are interdependent and we need to not isolate ourselves. Are those contradictory?
Well, they're not contradictory, but there is something of an asymmetry, a gap between his acknowledgement of an interdependent, interconnected world and his insistence on policies that seem to be about building walls, creating trade wars, creating isolated nations that do their own thing.
Sanders, you're talking
That's
about.
Sanders now. That's Sanders. And by the way, there is a certain intersection and overlap, which is why some of the people on both sides of Sanders and Trump go back and forth in this fear of globalization, this fear of interdependence. And again, the reality is, and I don't know if Sanders fully acknowledges it, that interdependence requires policies, whether in immigration, whether in trade, whether with respect to disease, whether with respect to markets, that acknowledge the interdependence and don't try to fight it, that don't go back as Brexit does to saying every man an island, every country an island, put up the walls, pull in the bridges and moats, and surround yourselves and don't let anyone in or out.
And so, Russ Roberts, how do you explain what so many Americans at least perceive as an effect of globalization, which is that we've had a declining middle class since NAFTA and even before, that so many manufacturing jobs since these trade agreements have really started being signed in the last few decades. So many manufacturing jobs have gone to other countries, and as Bernie Sanders would emphasize, the wealth and the income have concentrated in the top 1% or so. Does globalization, does lowering the trade barriers, does the freer flow of capital by multinational corporations to build factories in other countries to re-import here cheaper have nothing to do with it?
Well, I think you have to be careful and remind yourself that correlation isn't causation. Just because certain things are happening at the same time doesn't mean they cause them. And then there's the question whether the facts are facts, whether it's actually true that middle class incomes are stagnating. I don't think that's true. I think that's a mismeasurement and a cherry picking of the data. I don't think what is true. Here's what is true. What is true is that manufacturing employment has been falling steadily, but long before we had free trade agreements. It goes back to the end of World War II. So if you look at the data and look at the facts, going back to, say, 1945 or so, so that's about 70 years. For about 70 years, manufacturing employment as a percentage of total employment has been falling steadily for two reasons. One is trade. The other is technology. As we add technology to the manufacturing process, we don't need as many workers as we once did. That's true in agriculture. It's true in manufacturing. It's mainly a good thing. It means we're richer, more productive as a country. The bad part is if that's what you plan to do with your life, if you want to be a farmer or if you want to work in a factory, those opportunities have gotten less available now than they were 30, 40, 50, 60, and even 20 years ago. What trade has done is accelerated that a little bit. Probably trade with China has meant that manufacturing jobs have decreased at an increasing rate. We have even fewer than we had before. There's been a little bit of a recovery since the recession, but we could make those jobs come back. We could decide, as Trump has suggested, I think it'd be a terrible mistake. We could say, well, we're not going to let in Chinese products. That would create a lot of jobs in the United States. We'd be a lot poorer as a nation, just like we could keep the blacksmith jobs if we banned cars. When cars came along at the beginning of the 20th century.
Why would we be poorer as a nation? What would we lose that would be worse than those jobs that you just said we would get back?
Well, we'd have to make all those things for ourselves, and we're not as good at making them as the Chinese are. It's like saying, well, let's build a building. We could use spoons to dig out the foundation, or we can use shovels, or we could use a mechanized excavation machine. Well, the excavation machine only requires one person to run the controls. Hey, let's have shovels. That'll be even better. We'll have hundreds and hundreds of jobs.
But what do you mean we're not good at? We can't make clothing here, which is a big thing that we import from China that we used to make. We can't build the iPhones here that we invented here. Really?
We can. If we do, it'll be a lot more expensive. The clothing will be more expensive. The iPhones will be more expensive. And that means we'll have fewer resources to do other things. The reason we've been able to expand opportunity in so many jobs in so many other areas is because we don't try to do everything for ourselves. What trade does is it changes the kind of jobs we do. If we closed our walls, closed our borders, put up walls, kept out foreigners, kept out foreign products, we would have lots of jobs in the United States, but their productivity would be dramatically lower than the jobs we currently have. So we could have full employment as an isolated protectionist country, but we'd be poorer. We'd have to pay a lot more in money and time and effort to have the things that we have now.
Before we go on to some other aspects, and you're smiling and almost laughing, I just want to do a reality check here and see if you're on the same page.
Well, no, I'm not. You know, capitalism and globalization have two things in common. They're remarkably good at overall productivity. They create a wealthier country. They create a wealthier world. They're remarkably bad at distribution. They don't know how to distribute that. And like capitalism, globalization does not distribute its profitability, its productivity, its global capacity to do things more efficiently and more cheaply well, which means there are victims, there are winners and losers. And Donald Trump and in England, Brexit is about the losers complaining that they are losers and to say, well, you may be a loser, but overall workers win. The question is which workers? I heard recently a great story about Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh area. About 12,000 steel jobs have been lost in the last 30 or 40 years as a result of the cessation of manufacturing of steel in the United States. And the response is, yes, but there's 66,000, 5 times more new health care jobs. Well, that's great, except the steel workers are not in healthcare. So they remain victims, new people coming and get the healthcare jobs. And the problem we have is that there are a lot of permanent victims of this great, more productive, wealthier world in places who are now complaining politically, and they say, you will not make progress for the world on my back. You will suffer if you do that. We will vote against you. We'll vote Trump. We'll vote Sanders. We'll vote Brexit. And until we recognize that, this wonderful overall picture of a more productive, wealthy world is going to create nothing but political suffering and political chaos.
All right.
The question is, the other guest suggests that capitalism, globalization aren't very good at distributing the benefits. And that's certainly true in the sense that it's not perfect. As I mentioned earlier, there are lots of people who are harmed by trade, in a particular area, a particular kind of trade. Certainly competition can be hard, and that's true not just of trade, but of economic change generally, as he points out, under capitalism. At the same time, I think you have to recognize that over the last 50, 75, 100, 200 years, what has transformed people's lives is capitalism, is globalization, without the need, without the government requirements, without the mandates to redistribute income. The average person's standard of living has been totally transformed, not just in America, but throughout the world by trade and exchange and freedom. And that didn't require massive government redistribution about who gets the gains and who gets the losses. True, in any one generation, it can be very hard. Over 2 and 3 generations, everybody gets their lives improved. And I think it's a very powerful force.
Well, maybe sometimes the market works by itself. Well, without political intervention, sometimes it needs more to distribute things with some basic fairness, but we're not going to settle that today.
Just one thing, Brian, you can't write off 2 or 3 generations. Don't worry, your generation and the next, and maybe your grandchildren, they'll suffer. But beyond that, your great-grandchildren, should we have a world to live in, are going to be okay. Those are real people. And those are the people who create revolutions. They create populist revolts. They voted for Brexit. Many are voting for Trump, some for Sanders. We can't say to them, oh, just wait a couple generations. It's all going to be okay. You'll see.
So, Brexit. They wanted to leave the European Union. They wanted to focus more on national institutions and less on international institutions. You want to focus more on mayors. That would be even more local than the national institutions. So are you like the same as Brexit, only more so?
The difference is cities are local, but they are also global in a way that states are not. Every single local problem we think of facing mayors and municipal government today, climate change, refugees, terrorism and security, jobs, inequality, education are also identical to what we call the global challenges. States are still concerned about national borders, about Ukraine versus Russia, about a Palestinian state, about the place of a United Kingdom that includes or doesn't Scotland and North Ireland and Wales. Those are their questions. So in an odd way, cities have much more in common with the global agenda than states do. So there is a kind of vote that votes against the nation state, but for both going down to the city and up to the global level. Those things happen at the same time.
So do you think it's no coincidence that the London metropolitan area voted heavily against Brexit, while places that are more rural, more away from the central city voted for?
Yes, by the way, in England, there were in the Northeast, in cities like Sunderland and others, you actually had cities voting for Brexit also, because they're among the victims. They were not seeing the benefits of being part of Europe. So even some cities, but on the whole, the big global cities, whether it's New York or Paris or Tokyo or Mexico City or Singapore or Seoul or Detroit even now, are going to be for a constructive interdependence because they understand their future depends on being part of a global world, not trying to separate for it. So that the Brexit vote voted up, it did divide up that way. But the other side of it, and this is true for those when we think about Trump, is that when they vote against Europe and for an exit of Britain, when they vote for Trump and against the establishment, Republican and Democratic, in Washington, part of that is isolationist, part of that is anti-globalization, part of that is even xenophobic, but another part is pro-democratic. They are saying in England, Brussels is not democratic. Brussels makes bureaucratic decisions about what's good for us without asking us. And Europe, the European Commission, has had a profoundly undemocratic way of dealing with its people. It's often seen as more about the euro than about the Europeans. So part of the English vote was an understandable vote on behalf of democracy, and I think they will find in England that it's in the cities that they're going to get more of that.
Could an international institution like the EU have done it better, or could they learn from this and do it better in the future so there isn't a Frexit and a Germexit and et cetera, et cetera?
They could, and interestingly, they are. I just returned 2 weeks ago from a Council of Europe meeting in The Hague that included members of the Committee on the Regions and Cities, which is the European department that deals with regions and cities. People are beginning to talk about not a Europe of states, but a Europe of cities. People are beginning to talk about giving more resources back to the cities where they take them from in revenues and allowing the cities a larger role. People are beginning to say that until we see cities as the key, Europe is going to be in trouble. So I would say there are people in the Parliament, the European Parliament, in the European Commission, who are beginning to acknowledge that cities are where the action is, cities are where the democracy is, and if Europe is going to survive, it has to start talking not just about regions and states and bureaucracies, but about the cities, about the metropolis, where people live, where people vote, and where people's interests are protected.
So, Russ Roberts, you could react to that, and I'm also curious to get your take on what, if any, lessons there are for the United States from the Brexit vote.
I agree with Professor Barber there that I think there's a pro-democratic side to it. It's a multi-causal phenomenon. People have lots of motives for why they might support it, just as they have a lot of motives for why they might support Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. Part of it is, as he said, anti-globalization, xenophobic, and some of it is just people are tired of the way things are being run now, a feeling that they're being taken advantage of, their voices aren't being heard, and that the system is rigged. And of course, the system is rigged to some extent. I mean, we have to recognize the fact that there are corporations that get special treatment through trade deals. There are corporations that don't have to pursue free trade because they get a special exemption, and that's atrocious. So crony capitalism and crony trade is a disaster. It's bad for democracy. It's bad for economics, bad for our system. And so I certainly agree with that. I think, what we can learn from Brexit remains to be seen. I don't think we know exactly how it's going to turn out. We had a bunch of angry people, certainly, who wanted something different. Whether they like what they get remains to be seen. We don't know what they're going to get. So it's a fascinating time to be a student of such things, and not such a good time, perhaps, to be a citizen. We have to wait and see.
Do you see, as a student of economics, a long-term decline in the UK's economy as a result of the Brexit? We see the pound going down to about $1.33, which is a low over a long period of time. Do you see this as just kind of an adjustment period? I mean, there was a prosperous Britain before there was the European Union only a few decades ago.
Yeah, I think it's way too early to tell. I think it depends what kind of relationships they'll have with Europe, the relationships they'll have with the United States. I hope that they'll have a free trade agreement with the European Union. They'll have a free trade agreement with the United States, that this is not representative of isolationism, but rather a desire to not be under the thumb of Brussels, which they can't express their voice. And that I totally get. So I think it's too early to tell whether Europe will, whether the UK will have a tough time or not.
Which would mean, by the way, and this is their issue, not our issue, but if they have a free trade agreement with Europe, wouldn't that mean that the same immigrant workers who they don't want coming from Eastern Europe into the UK would then be allowed to come still, because that would be part of the EU's conditions?
It could be. They're going to have to negotiate that, and certainly they're going to have to make those decisions, whoever's in charge of their government, just like ours does. We don't know what's going to happen in the United States. Donald Trump claims he's going to build a wall. I doubt it. He claims that somehow my immigrants are destroying our economy. I don't think that's true. But people are afraid. People get scared, and I think appeals to fear, appeals to the worst side of us are always going to be very powerful. We see that as part of Brexit, as part of Donald Trump's appeal as well.
So, Ben Barber, you're going to have a Congress of Mayors coming up this fall, right?
We are indeed. And let me just say, by the way, that I agree with our friend from Stanford, because, in fact, we are already seeing buyer's remorse in England. We are already seeing that the person winning now the polls and likely to be the next prime minister to replace David Cameron, who's resigned, is not Michael Gove, who supported Boris Johnson and who supported Brexit, but rather a pro-stay person, Theresa May, Home Secretary, and she looks like she's moving out ahead. And it's also true that what they negotiate is unlikely to, it may be Brexit, but it won't be break it. It's going to be staying in all kinds of ways. There'll be new agreements and so on. But the fact is, the nations of Europe, England, the United States, increasingly are violating in a fundamental way the social contract from 400 years ago. The social contract called for people to obey states, democratic sovereign states, because those states would guarantee their sustainability, their life, and their liberty. Increasingly in the area of terrorism, climate change, and the economy, states can't guarantee their citizens' sustainability, and it becomes the responsibility of cities to do that. We are convening in September in The Hague a group of up to 100 cities from all over the world, 5 continents, which will take on, in the default of state sovereignty, the right to start making common policy together to sustain their citizens against climate change, to sustain their citizens against terrorism, and to sustain their citizens against injustice.
We just have 30 seconds. Give me one concrete example how that would work city to city on a policy.
Take climate change, one of the biggest issues we will face and have decisions on. There is a new technology called waste to energy that converts waste to energy, captures the methane, gets rid of all those landfills, and provides enormous advantages. If 1,000 cities around the world do that together, the technology is cheap, it can be done, and it becomes a great contribution to the battle against climate change.
Ben Barber, Russ Roberts, thank you both very much. And that's POTUS 2016 for this week. We're here every week at this time, calling the presidential horse race and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.